Okay, we're now going to focus on Philippine and China relations, and we want to do a assessment of 2017 in terms of our foreign policy, especially the Philippine-China foreign policy pivot, and the past and the prospects that we can see, or our guests will see, for the year ahead. But before we move on to that, let me just give Ambassador Encomienda a moment to further reflect on the removal of the legacy of Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan. Please.
Well, actually, it's a matter of personal interest. I do not know the inner thinking of the Taiwanese government doing that, but the way it struck me, it was just a small item in the newspapers, was this is like the great proletariat cultural revolution in Taiwan. I mean, you remove vestiges of the past to introduce your own. Now, the thing is, we have to presume that the direction of Taiwan is towards the kind of democratic direction followed from the West.
That's right. Yeah.
But I do not still understand why they have to remove it in that manner, very dramatically by law. So, in effect, that is what I'm seeing as the reason, the rationale for the great proletariat cultural revolution is happening in Taiwan in its own way.
Yeah. The other more political interpretation from my perspective is DPP has not been garnering the support that it had when it was elected. Basically because the economic situation is not as rosy as expected. And one would not be surprised with the souring of relations of the DPP with mainland. This is to be expected. This could be a measure to fire up the sense of identity of the Taiwanese to further boost support for the DPP.
Yes.
But, yeah.
Still, I go by
yes.
my own assessment, personal assessment, that relating it to history, this is the equivalent of a great proletariat cultural revolution.
Yes.
How it goes, we don't know.
Yes, and so we'll be observing that and following that. So, talking about our Philippine-China foreign policy pivot, Ambassador Alberto Encomienda was pivotal, I think, in arguing the case for declaring the PCA as water under the bridge, which we will go further. But let me go back to a 6-minute clip from our January 1st discussion, wrapping up 2016. This was January 1st of 2017 when we had this discussion. So let's roll that 6-minute clip, and I think you'll enjoy watching yourself 1 year younger. Okay. Dominant at that time was those who were advocating the Philippines pushing for this arbitration. Yes. And let's review some of the claims made by those proponents of the pursuit of this arbitration. Justice Carpio, maybe Roy Logoles, and the others, and some from UP.
The Department of Foreign Affairs.
Department of Foreign Affairs.
Secretary Del Rosario, and Ambassador Henry Bensurto.
That's right.
Yes.
Can you help us summarize maybe 2 or 3 points that they were saying would happen with the victory, if the Philippines had the victory at the arbitration?
Well, really, looking at it from my own perspective, having studied this third-party dispute settlement, firstly, I had it on record in a monograph that I gave you a copy of way back in 2014, which I wrote after the arbitration petition was filed, which I wrote in 2013, that issue cannot be settled in 3 years. Why? It is just so complicated. I said in that monograph that if you look at other cases right here in our region, say between Singapore and Malaysia on a simple rock where a lighthouse was located, in the International Court of Justice, it took more than 3 years to settle that issue. We have the Sipadan and Ligitan case between Indonesia and Malaysia. Again, 2 islands, but only 2 parties took more than 3 years to resolve. So I said way back then that this is not possible to be settled in 3 years, but it was. And that is for me a cause for, some suspicions of manipulation simply because, number one, there are 5 parties, not just 2. Number 2, these 5
Who are the 5 parties for the benefit of the audience?
It is, of course, China, Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, Vietnam, and a so-called political entity, which is Taiwan. So it's 6 all in all, effectively, yes.
That's right.
And with all these 6 parties, with different bases for their claims and different definitions of those geological features, how could you settle that in 3 years? Right. I thought it was impossible, but it happened.
Now we're of course looking at these things from hindsight, but before the us witnessing the aftermath, which seems to be very different from what was promised and projected by the proponents of the arbitration. For example, that number 1, there will be so much international support for the Philippine position that China will be forced to comply, and several other things which maybe you can enumerate for us.
Well, all you need to do is read the newspapers. I have no inside track of what's happening within the Department of Foreign Affairs.
At that time?
Yes, but as I was already retired. But just going by the newspapers, and this is how you can validate it and verify what I'm saying, that the public diplomacy, so-called, the propaganda, if you wish, cites 4 things. Number 1, that when, not if, when we will win the ruling,
it's as if they were certain
we would win. They were certain that we will win. When we win the ruling, China will be shamed into compliance. So 6 months after the ruling came down, has China at all been shamed into compliance? No. Number 2, the public diplomacy then says that when the ruling comes down in favor of the Philippines and China does not comply, China will become an international outlaw.
A pariah. A
pariah state. Now the thing is, outlaw is a contraction of the phrase outside the law. That's right. But and the further problem there is the number 1 outlaw is in regard to the Law of the Sea Convention is in fact the United States of America, which is the one egging us to go into.
Because the U.S. did not even ratify.
Did not ratify. It's not within the. Now the third one is that when the ruling comes down, which is expected to be in favor of the Philippines, and the issue was always enforcement, the international community will join together to help to enforce the decision. What has happened? Even the foremost supporter of the Philippines, which was the United States, in fact began advocating negotiations. That's this right. was in Laos, Secretary Kerry. 5th, that when the ruling comes down, which will be expected to be in favor of the Philippines, other claimant countries will join in bringing a case against.
And of course, they were always floating the idea that Vietnam would follow suit.
Exactly, Vietnam especially. 6 months after the ruling came down, Vietnam has not said anything.
In fact, after the ruling came down, a few months later, I think 2-3 months later, Vietnam was the first to pay an official visit, a high-level official visit to China.
Yes, that's right.
Then,
yes.
Of course, Duterte in October.
Yes.
So, again, looking at this from hindsight, what are the lessons to be learned? 1, there are forces that tried to push us into a conflict situation.
Yes. And if I may go ahead of the story, this is precisely why I think one of the reasons why President Duterte is using in very strong language independent foreign policy. That's right. That's right. There has been too much of interventions that has happened in the past, from certain quarters.
Well, it seems also, reflecting on the past, what some people wanted to imply and inject is that if you're not belligerent against China on this issue, you're not patriotic, you're not independent, you're pro-China. Exactly. Don't you think so? Isn't that one of the...
Well, that is how it hit me.
Yeah.
I've always been advocating only Philippine interests. But sometimes Philippine interests could jibe with China or could jibe with any other country.
That's right.
But in the in the situation then, in the narrative of the situation then, because China has been effectively portrayed as a bully, as an outlaw,
deliberately,
anybody who tries to explain China's position is seen to be pro-China, anti-American, and anti-Filipino.
Okay, so if our background were not different, they'd think that it's still the same show.
Exactly.
But so a year after that, what's your assessment? Has this advice been taken? Off cam we were discussing, and you really want to see this this treated as water under the bridge. Do you think this has happened in the entire year of 2017?
I would say so. I mean, as you said, looking at that clip, it's like I'm saying that only now.
Yeah.
Nothing has changed in that context. But more than that, I mean, the premise now is it has been a year and a half since the ruling. Further receding into hindsight, we can see that nothing concrete or nothing constructive has happened. But if you ask whether there has been a change, I would say yes. And very emphatically, I would like to say the change happens to be not on our side, but on the side of the United States of America. In the APEC summit in Hanoi, before the ASEAN summit here, President Donald Trump already made a very public offer to arbitrate those the South China Sea on the South China Sea issues.
Yes, he was addressing the Vietnamese, and well, directly there because he was in Hanoi.
Yes,
he was addressing the Vietnamese.
But in the context of APEC.
Yeah, in the context of APEC, of course, within earshot of China and the Philippines.
Yes.
Yeah.
But more than that, when he came to the Philippines for the ASEAN summit, he said the same thing. He is a good arbitrator.
Okay.
He was offering to arbitrate. Now, my point there is, for me, my perspective, my take on that is that even the United States has set aside the PCA ruling. Don't forget that was a big issue against President Duterte when President Duterte used the word, I'm setting aside the PCA. The strongest reactor there was Justice Carpio. And now, that is my take. Why would President Trump offer to arbitrate, and this is the highest official of the strongest country in the world, why would he offer to arbitrate on something that has been settled by arbitration? There's something wrong there.
So that reflects his attitude, his view of the PCA.
Exactly.
That it really isn't of significance to him. That is why he is offering to arbitrate himself.
Exactly. And that means, as you said, it's all, the PCA ruling is all water under the bridge.
Yes.
For the U.S., they might want to start anew by the United States President himself arbitrating. That means the PCA ruling is out. And on our part of this world, we have events now being directed by China, which is to our advantage in many ways.
But it seems that there are still a few elements that keeps trying to revive this. And if we can go back to the ASEAN meetings just a month or two ago, Albert de Rosario, the former DFA secretary, kept on saying that ASEAN is giving up and surrendering to China and blah, blah, blah. Do you think this still has any impact?
You can speak for yourself and your own observations. Has it has not done anything. To me, they were just also wrapping up their own situation. That they're out of the picture. They're irrelevant, especially because said in the context of ASEAN, ASEAN is more than the South China Sea issues. As even bilaterally with China, the South China Sea issues is beyond the bilateral aspects of our relationship, you know. But in ASEAN, ASEAN is a lot more than the South China Sea issues. Why would a former Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and in fact to some extent even Secretary Roberto Romulo, says this about the ASEAN, recent ASEAN meeting, that it failed on the South China Sea issues. I don't know why our focus. Okay, let me just digress a bit probably from that focus on the political aspects. Talking about ASEAN and what happened in our hosting, my God, the role of Joey Concepcion, highlighting the commercial and economic aspect of it, he should be, given sufficient recognition and acknowledgement for that role. But all these, some quarters just want to sweep aside the other achievements of ASEAN and our role there, like what Joy Concepcion has been doing on Go Negosyo, and focus on the South China Sea issues, which is, as I said, water under the bridge. And that has been, I think, finally declared by no less than President Trump.
Yes, that's right. Now, before we go on to 2018, the prospects of this Philippine-China foreign relation pivot, let me take a look at what has happened in 2017. There have been two high-level delegations, including Vice Premier Wang Yang in, I think, March of this year. And Wang Yi is Foreign Minister. Yes. And that figures in our bilateral talks that started, I think, in May or sometime there. In China. So that's the first formal bilateral talks on the dispute issues. And then, of course, the arrival of Premier Li Keqiang during the ASEAN meet here for the ASEAN plus one, ASEAN plus China. Of course, there have been attempts to try to disparage the $25 billion understanding for projects between China and the Philippines. But of course, 1 year is just preparation for the agreements, the paperwork, the research, the surveys, and so on. But committed are several projects already worth several billions, and two grants for bridges across the Pasig to help alleviate the traffic. So there have been a lot of concrete economic projects and financial arrangements that benefit the Philippines for the 2017. That's my assessment of 2017. It was a year of preparation for the infrastructure, build, and so on, which includes the bridges. No, I think the bridges for the Visayas will be in the second basket, which I'll bring up a little later on when we talk about the 2018. So 2017, in terms of the economic and financial cooperation of the Philippines and China, I think it's very concrete. What about you? What do you see in the past 12 months?
Well, it's true that we see a bulge or spurt of bilateral activity, and you use the word disparage, and it is true that, we have some warnings have been said that we will be hacking the future generations.
We'll be indebting the Philippines.
Yes, but some quarters make it appear that China is doing this to win us over. Look, how many years were we outside of China's, shall we say, sights, If I may go to a really concrete situation that is on scientific exchanges.
That's right,
You read the vision of China on the Belt and Road Initiative. On the last 2 pages, it had an enumeration of bilateral exchanges relating to marine environmental protection and scientific research, all the way to Bangladesh, down to ASEAN countries, except the Philippines. What I'm trying to say here is this. On a lot of aspects, business and everything, science interaction, people-to-people interaction, as you said, we have been left behind because the situation was unfavorable. Circumstances were unfavorable. Once the situation improved, then this flooded in, including the infrastructure part of it. I hope we can put in the proper perspective by citing the fact that China is not giving us a special treatment in this. We are, and China for that matter, we can say, is playing catch up on the bilateral aspect of our relations. This kind of infrastructure assistance is happening in Cambodia, Malaysia, you mentioned Bangladesh, you mentioned, and you won't believe it, even East Timor is receiving, So this is not, shall we say, what's happening now between China and the Philippines is a catch-up mode for both countries. It is not a special, shall we say, intended with some strings attached, you know. We are both trying to pursue normal relations, and we are in a catch-up mode after a loss of almost 12 years.
Okay. So I think 2017 we can say is a good year for the Philippines and China working together.
For a new beginning.
For a new, okay, that's very well put. So let's, one aspect of course here, and very few understand this, but you as the visionary for the maritime state that the Philippines should be, you have written a paper explaining this, and please give us a gist of your vision of the maritime state. And I bring this up because this has relation to what you just mentioned, Xi Jinping's vision for research, scientific research, and so on. So how's this? How do you pronounce it? I still haven't mastered it.
JOMSRE, Joint Oceanographic Marine Scientific Research Expedition.
Okay, now the 2017 sweeping aside of the PCA opened us to this joint cooperation. Now I remember you're one of the initiators of the Joint Marine Seismic Survey before.
Yes, okay.
And that was aborted because of the Aquino administration that came in. Do you think now the way is open for your vision of the JOMSRE?
Well, my first objection to what you said is I'm not a visionary. It's not my vision. Our being a maritime country and archipelagic state was a vision way back in the 60s by, I give the credit to Senator Arturo Tolentino. Maybe the idea and the vision belong somewhere else, but it was Senator Tolentino with Undersecretary Ingles and our permanent representative to the United Nations who articulated it and brought it into the open, culminating in its being accepted in the Law of the Sea Convention. So there is nothing visionary for me there. Okay. But on the matter of JOMSRE, for example, again, that began. Again,
let's please explain JOMSRE.
The Joint Oceanographic Maritime Research Expedition. That began during the time of, that was initiated by President Ramos together with his Vietnamese counterpart.
And Secretary Alcala is involved?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah, but...
Former Agriculture Secretary. Yeah.
No, not... No? DNR Secretary.
DNR.
Angel C. Alcala.
Alcala, yes.
Then after his tenure, we brought him in as our chief scientist for JOMSRE. Now, JOMSRE, the visionary there is President Ramos and his counterpart, the President of Vietnam. That shortly after the Vietnam War, and don't forget, we had a contingent in South Vietnam. The two presidents decided that we undertake joint marine research expeditions in the South China Sea between the two countries. And also that was in the wake of the recognition of governments between Vietnam and the Philippines. That was very successful. But I must emphasize that was led by scientists and really was looking at more on the ocean processes rather than the dispute situation.
That's right, that's right.
Yes, and that was meant to develop confidence between Vietnam and the Philippines, but we later graduated it to under the UNCLOS as an undertaking under UNCLOS Part 9 on enclosed, semi-enclosed seas.
When did China come into the picture?
Well, the scientists of the two countries, Vietnam and the Philippines, after 4 cruises back and forth, decided that they have covered the southern part of the Spratlys Archipelago. When this was happening, nobody was talking about disputes. It is led by scientists about pure science research, and so that was what was always in the discussion. That the scientists felt that the southern part of the Spratlys Archipelago has been sufficiently covered with 4 cruises back and forth, and the data has been gathered, database has been set up. They want to go up north. this is a very interesting story. I think I should expand on this some more.
Yes.
And so they recommended to the governments that we either go up north or go down south, but leave that central part. It has been properly covered. Now, the choice, actually, whether we go up north or we go down south, by the scientists was this. It had a political connotation because going north would involve China. And with this situation then, we were not sure China would agree. So there was a backup contingency plan that if China won't agree, we go south towards Sabah and Brunei.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so this was endorsed by the governments of Vietnam and the Philippines. I was, in fact, chosen to talk to China, to do the consultations with China. And if I can be allowed to be more dramatic, China jumped on the opportunity.
Very interesting, yeah.
So it happened very quickly. Right away, China offered the research ship, which is 3 times the size of our research ships. And we toured the ship initially. Then we had a preparatory meeting in Manila, in Guangzhou, and the last one was to have in Vietnam, in Nha Trang. And the way things went, the preparations for that, what we now call Jomsre Phase 2, went very smoothly, that everything, 95% were covered, including the cruise tracks, were covered in the meetings in Manila and Guangzhou.
Yes.
But when the wrap-up session came up with China, we threw in the monkey wrench. And,
well, the monkey wrench seems to be put aside today, do you think?
I hope so, because we have a ASEAN-China declaration on a decade for marine, coastal and marine environmental protection. And I'm personally looking at that very closely, because if the Philippine government is inclined to, I'm no longer with the government, that is the occasion to revive these events.
I'm being signaled that we have run out of time, but I'm going to request 4 or 5 minutes because we are not yet finished. It's very interesting. So, okay, so the Jomsre is again on the possibly on the table. I think we should help promote it with the Duterte government and so on. But we have to move on to 2018, the prospects. Of course, the second package, the second basket they call it, of projects is now being discussed for 2018, and this includes many of the projects in Mindanao, the Visayas, and so on. So clearly, the prospects there is very positive. But in terms of in terms of diplomacy, do you see any obstacles, obstruction, pitfalls ahead?
I really do not think so. But in fact, I wanted to go back to your use of the pivot, applying it to diplomacy. There was no pivot on the part of the Philippines. Pivot was used by President Obama in a strategic military sense. We know that. But we adapted it to look at the diplomatic part of it between China and Philippines. To me, where I came from in the Department of Foreign Affairs, you don't use the word pivot. You just look at your vital national interests and pursue it. And that is what President Duterte did it. And I am glad that he did it in a way that he cited the Constitution, that in fact it is part of pursuing an independent foreign policy. Because it is to me, very, very, shall we say, critical to cite that, because if you say that we might be in hack with China, we have long been hacked with the United States. Okay?
So, in conclusion, anything else? So, cooperation is I think, in the 2018 agenda for more cooperation, more positive joint efforts, and we will see finally in the coming months the fruition of the shift in foreign policy under President Duterte. Any final words for our audience?
Okay, I go back to how I was accused before with being pro-China, simply because I said China is doing everything right, pursuing its national interest. The United States is doing everything right, pursuing its national interest. Our problem is ourselves.
Yes.
We do not seem to have one direction or one common understanding of where our vital national interests lie. The big issue that is being, shall we say, that is going on in the South China Sea, as I said, it's not between China and the Philippines. It is between China and the United States. If China wants to invade the Philippines, does it really have to spend that much money to reclaim and build air bases and militarize those islands? It would rather spend that as capital for improving economic relations with the rest of the region.
That's right.
You know? It does not need to that money could be better spent in that sense, you know?
Yes, yes, yes.
And so I would not say that taking up from your point, you know, I would say that we only need to look at
our national interest.
Our national interest. We don't have to align it with China. We just need to look at what China is doing as the biggest regional economic and military power and see how we could it could help us in promoting our national interest.
Okay, so we've run out of time, but we have 2018 and our future episodes to further elaborate on the many issues. Thank you very much, and we hope you have a good weekend.